So every year, Samsung comes out with dozens of new phones, but for one reason or another, most people only hear about 3 or 4 of them. Most people know about the flagship S series, the flagship Note series, and maybe people know a little bit about the mid-range A series. Now that still leaves a lot of phones that are almost completely forgotten. And granted, a bunch of these phones are going to be budget phones that are not especially exciting to review, but occasionally you find a phone that is just overlooked. It's an exciting phone, has great features, great specs, and a great price, and it just happens to not get reviewed. And that's exactly what we're talking about in this video. So the phone we're talking about in this video is the Samsung Galaxy F62. I've been using it for a couple weeks now, and it's starting to become more popular in India for its low price tag of just $399, a massive screen, 6.7 inches, a really massive battery of 7,000 milliamp hours to easily get you through multiple days. It has an SD card slot, dual SIM, charger in the box, headphone jack. It really has a lot to offer at this mid-range price point. Oh, and it also has the same processor we saw on the Galaxy Note 10, so it's not a slow phone either. Okay, so let's get into a physical tour of this phone. Starting off on the right side, we have our volume rocker right above the power button. Very standard for Samsung phones to do this, but what's not standard is that the power button also doubles as a fingerprint sensor. Typically, Samsung likes to put their fingerprint sensor under the screen, but occasionally to save money, they'll just put it in the power button. We saw it with the Tab S7, and honestly, I really like this. I think it's more convenient. You're gonna be tapping the power button a lot of times anyway, so putting it there is a great thing to do. On the back of this phone, we do have a quad camera setup, but it's like a quad camera setup, you know? So we'll talk about that later on, but the main shooter is 64 megapixels, very promising lens, and of course I will get into a full test of that. The back of this phone, this is like a blue and silver one, and it is actually a plastic back, as you can kind of tell here. It was honestly really hard to film because it is literally like a mirror on the top and then blue on the bottom. So that look, I think it looks kind of cool, but is it my favorite aesthetic for a phone? No, I personally prefer matte backs on a phone, but the plastic is not necessarily a bad thing. Now, the other things we have on this phone, we do have a headphone jack, we have a USB Type-C charging and data transfer port. Of course, it does come with a charging cable and brick in the box. That's nice to see, and it is a fast charger that it comes with, 25 watts, although with a 7,000 milliamp hour battery, 25 watts isn't exactly fast charging anymore. It still takes a while to charge this up because that battery is so large, but again, it's just nice to see that in the box. At least you're not using like a 5-watt charger that you might have kicking around your house. Like 25 watts at least gets it, reasonably quick. If we look at the SIM tray, we have a dual SIM slot as well as an SD card slot in there, so you can put expandable storage up to 1 terabyte, and by default, this phone does come with 128 gigabytes of storage on board. Honestly, I never really expand my storage anyway. I'd rather just use cloud storage, but it's something that if you want it, it is available. You can put an SD card in this phone. Now, flipping the phone over to the front, we have a 32 megapixel hole punch selfie camera on the top, and the screen is 6.7 inches. It gets pretty bright. It doesn't really have great dynamic range though, so the colors, it's decent, but it's not the best out there, which is to be expected for this price range. It also is only 60 hertz, which normally I would say is not a big deal, but we're starting to see more and more mid-range phones come out with that high refresh rate screen, so it is a little bit more of an antiquated screen, but regardless, most people buying this phone won't notice any kind of difference there, and it's going to be a great display for you. Now, as far as the overall feel of the phone goes, it is a larger phone. You can definitely tell from the large screen that it's a big phone, but it's also a little bit thicker as well with that big battery on board. Considering that the battery is 7,000 milliamp hours, which is double, triple, maybe even 4 times the size of an iPhone battery, depending on which iPhone you're looking at, I mean, it's impressive that the battery, like the phone is not heavier than it is. So overall, it's a big phone, yes, but it's not nearly as big as I expected it to be when I first read that it had 7,000 milliamp hours of battery inside. And speaking of the battery, I think it's to be expected that you'd be getting a long battery life out of this, easily getting through 2 days from my experience, but it wasn't as long as I hoped for. But the fact is that the processor in here, it is a fast processor, and it's the same one that we saw in the Galaxy Note 10, but it's not a Snapdragon. It was the Exynos version, which is the 9825. Again, pretty quick processor, but what that's really known for is its inefficiency with battery. When the Note 10 came out, a lot of people complained that the Exynos version didn't last nearly as long as the Snapdragon version, and here again, we're seeing the same thing, which, I mean, it's compensated, more than compensated with the 7,000 milliamp hour battery, but you just want to keep in mind, it's not going to be lasting like 5 days. Okay, so I think you guys have the general idea of what this phone is like physically, but let's start talking a little bit more about using this phone. And one of the things people really care about with the phone, and rightfully so, is the camera setup. So if we look at the back of this phone, we have 4 cameras, like I said. One of them is the main shooter, the 64 megapixel primary lens, and I'll get into a full test of that in a second, but the other ones we have a 12 megapixel ultra wide lens. So those are the 2 lenses that I would really be using. Then the other ones, which is why I said quad camera in quotes, is because one of them is a 5 megapixel depth camera, which you will probably never use at all for anything. If it wasn't there, you wouldn't notice the difference. And of course, you have a 5 megapixel macro lens, which again, if it was not there, you would not notice that at all. Samsung even knows this, which is why when you open up the camera on the bottom, macro is not easily accessible, because it's really just a sales tactic that a lot of mid-range phones are using, where they're throwing in that macro lens. Nobody really wants it, nobody really uses it, it's low quality, and I wish they would just get rid of it and save the space. But regardless, it's there, and we're gonna get into a full test of that. Okay, so taking a look at the cameras, starting off with the macro lens, you can see why I don't like it. It's not really great quality, really poor sharpness, there's no autofocus. If they made it a higher quality lens at least, I would maybe appreciate it, but here you can see just not especially useful. Going to the ultra-wide lens, you can see a typical Samsung photo here, very high saturation, pretty good dynamic range as well, good sharpness, overall a pretty nice photo. I would say it's a little bit oversaturated, looks like the older Samsung lenses here, but as you zoom in, even digitally, it looks pretty decent. You can see here is a great example of the really oversaturated red in the middle, but again, the photos, especially for landscape, I think they still look pretty decent here. A little bit of warping on the edges with the ultra-wide lens, but the standard rear lens, like, I think it's a pretty good photo. You'll notice that the trees on the left of this photo look slightly weird with their coloration, but even again, here's another example of the digital zoom. When you zoom all the way in, it's still not even that bad. One weird thing is the rear portrait mode, however. My face is way over sharpened and there's some weird color on my nose and my forehead. It looks very, very abnormal. When we go to the selfie lens portrait mode, it does the opposite. It actually really softens your face a lot, almost too much. And then of course, in the non-selfie mode, the front-facing lens sometimes struggles a little bit with dynamic range, but otherwise it does a decent job. So here is a video test, and I'm walking around right now. It's really stable. We have great colors, pretty saturated, so the water looks a little bluer here than it does in real life. But otherwise, I think it looks really good, honestly. The stabilization does a great job. If I move quickly, it tries to stabilize, so you get a little bit of warping, but it gives it a much smoother look to it. We can also zoom, so if we zoom in, we're going into our, actually we don't have any other lens. We can go into 10x zoom with this lens, and let's see if it lets us zoom back out. It does. It lets us zoom smoothly between lenses, between the ultra wide and the standard wide angle lens. And honestly, they looked pretty consistent with color. So I think the transition, you can see when it happens right there, but otherwise, I think it looks pretty good. And now this is what it would sound like if somebody was talking. Again, we don't have a microphone on this side right next to the lenses, but we do have one on the top and bottom, so we should have a pretty good sound. But you guys can leave a comment and let me know how this sounds to you and how this video looks to you. All right, now the selfie camera is also 4K, which is awesome. We're getting some hard shadows from the sun right there, but it does a pretty decent job, pretty good dynamic range for a selfie camera. A little bit less saturated, I think, unless I'm just being blinded by the sun here. But you guys can leave a comment for this as well. Let me know how this looks and sounds to you. And that concludes our camera test. So some more about the experience with this phone. Like I said, the 9825 Exynos processor is pretty fast. It's going to be more than fast enough for anything you're doing. Most everyday tasks, the camera, everything's very responsive. Of course, if you're trying to do some very heavy gaming, you're definitely going to be able to reach the limits of this processor, but it definitely is doable. You can easily play games with this phone, and I had no problems with that either. This is running Android 11, so again, a very good experience on here, very up to date. And as far as a mid-range phone goes, I was impressed. It was very fast and has a decent amount of RAM. It definitely gets the job done, and you shouldn't be noticing any kind of problems. Now, the other things, this phone does also have NFC, which is something that we don't always see in mid-range phones, and it is really nice if you want to use Samsung Pay to have contactless payment at wherever you're going, gas stations, whatever. I like to see that, and I was really happy that this phone had that. So the experience with this phone overall was very positive. It didn't feel exactly like a flagship because you could tell like the phone's a little bulkier, it's a plastic back, and of course it is like the display is not a fast refresh display, but other than that, It runs very quickly, has plenty of storage, has a massive battery in there, and it's going to, in some ways, be similar enough to a flagship phone that I could easily use this phone as a daily driver. So the Samsung Galaxy F62 overall is a pretty decent mid-range phone. It's gonna be pretty quick, it's gonna have a great battery life, has a very large display, a nice fingerprint sensor, and it has pretty much everything you're looking for in a mid-range phone. Now, of course, they did cut some costs on things. The ultra-wide lens is not especially great. Two of the lenses, like the macro and the depth camera, are completely useless, and it doesn't have a telephoto lens. But with that being said, I mean, it's still nice to have an ultra-wide lens in case you have a very bright condition and you really want to use it, or you can use the primary shooter, which is a pretty decent camera. Overall, guys, this phone, I think it's pretty decent for the price, but you guys can leave a comment below and let me know what you think of the Samsung Galaxy F62. Depending on where you're located, this might or might not be available, so I'll put a link in the description. You guys can check out the latest price for this phone, and let me know what you think of it, if it's something that you'll be buying or not. As always, guys, I'm Mike O'Brien. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.